Are you in any way concerned about this relationship with China, which seems to have so many analysts, particularly in the West, a little bit worried about what China's real intentions are?
Yes, I'm concerned that the West is concerned about this because this relationship has evolved for a long time independent of Western concern. Then suddenly, or rather shockingly, after the turn of the century, China's new relations with Africa seems to have won a lot of interest in the West. And the attempt of the West, I should be very clear, is to try to make China see Africa through Western eyes. That, for me, is the most negative thing possible.
Right.
So that's the first statement I must make.
Right. And what, could you just expand on that a little bit? See China through Western eyes. What is that picture like?
The picture is the following. There are many development institutes, for example, in this country or in America. They have come out with a hypothesis or a thesis, which is that China does not know Africa's development. That's the assumption they make. They presume they know African development. So they go to China selling themselves by saying, you may have had relations with Africa on political terms, but when it comes to development, we, the West, are the specialists. We in Africa challenge that hypothesis, and I'm very glad that China also challenges that. And China and Africa have said, no, we can formulate our relations in all realms of life, political, economic, cultural, even military, independent of the West. Not ignoring what the West has done, but independently in terms of integrity. And I think that is what this forum on Africa-China relations is about.
And also, to bring you in, Andrew, as a Chinese and a specialist on this subject, do you feel that a lot of the concerns about China's involvement in Africa are rooted in that situation of, well, this is our territory and now you are infringing on an area where we dominated?
There was a bit of psychology or thinking along those lines, but I think it's a little bit ironic that, of course, the West has been engaging with Africa for a long, long time, but their experience and engagement has not been exactly exemplary. I mean, that includes, of course, a period of with the slave trade, amongst other things. But I think that China's engagement with Africa is really marked by a watershed. As you said at the beginning, China had been in Africa since the 50s, and leaving aside the very historical episodes of various visits to Africa in the past before the 50s. But even from the 50s all the way to when China opened up in 1978. So that period was more ideological. Of course, China was building the Tanzanian Railway, but there's always, at the back of it, is the ideology of China as a communist country. But since China opened up, it's entirely different. It is still, of course, is a coincidence of the development trajectory of both China and Africa. And since China opened up, China, of course, needs a lot of resources. But, of course, in terms of international trade, there's very little that Africa can compete with China in terms of manufactured products, and of course that they can supply all the energy and resources needs for China. And on the other hand, China gets all the resources. So again, there is a coincidence of wants. But secondly, China's approach to development, and of course China's approach to conflict resolution is very, very different from the West.
Okay, could you expand on what the differences are, especially with regard to development?
Well, in regard to development, I think China learned from its own story. China's past development is based on building a very solid foundation before they go on to other areas which, like full democracy, full liberalization, and they learn from not only from their own experience, but from experience in recent history. Even in the case of the USSR, I mean, the USSR collapsed because they didn't fail to build a solid economic foundation on which to build a more open and democratic society. And that kind of experience can be seen elsewhere in the world.
Yes.
So China, of course, is a huge country, is a fifth of mankind. Obviously, lots of problems inside China itself. And China knows for sure that they need to build up their own economic foundations. And through the engagement with Africa, you can see that China is putting a lot of emphasis building infrastructure, and even building schools, hospitals, training
Indeed, if I could bring you in, James, I don't mean to interrupt you. If I could bring you in, James, I mean, one of the major disappointments about Africa post-colonialism and what some would call a so-called independence is this lack of building an infrastructure and, you know, creating a real economic base for independence. And it would seem, for a lot of analysts, that China is filling that gap. Is that how you see it?
To a certain extent. The failure to have built the basis for economic independence in Africa resides primarily on Africans themselves. Failure to live up by looking around the world and seeing examples, which included China even then, or India at the time. But you must not overestimate the capacity of the new African ruling class to look for examples. There are not very many examples to go by, even by that time. However, the responsibility remains that we failed to come up with, despite the glorious attempts, various attempts in Tanzania, in Guinea, many countries, all seeking out. So we must acknowledge that. We must say there were serious attempts to try to reckon with what is the economic future of the continent.
And some analysts would say that a lot of those serious attempts were deliberately sabotaged and undermined by the former colonial power interests.
So the second point is that, indeed, Western interests were involved in the effort not for Africa to develop independently, or at least in terms of its capacity to be an independent actor, to be very limited. Therefore, the opening of China-Africa relations offers an alternative to this dominant system that has been in the area for hundreds of years. That is the challenge.
Yes, yes.
That is the question. Is this possible now? Can Africa now reckon with the opening of a new form of international relations, which puts the West onto the question? It says, are you going to be positive towards Africa, or are you going to be negative? It was not possible to talk about infrastructure for 30 years in Africa.
Yes.
The same countries were saying you are not able to do investment in Africa because you don't have good infrastructure. When Africa went to the World Bank and said we need roads and so on, no, we don't do that. So when China now turns up and says, we know what it means to be at that stage, build roads, build infrastructure, build schools, health clinics, and so on. That appeals to any African with a sense of Africa's destiny in mind.